Well, welcome to the Stepping Stones Project. Today is March 15th, 2015. My name is Carl Connor, and you're our special guest. We're so glad that you could be with us here today. Wanted to give a little bit of a shout out. We've had on the website some folks have been coming in from other places outside of the United States, and I have noticed some traffic coming in from the country of Brazil. So if you're listening to us today on this, we'd love to hear about you and hear how you found us, and would like to know a little more about you. So feel free to use the contact page on the steppingstonesproject.com to let us know about that. Well, let's continue in our story. This is Esther chapter 7, the death of Haman. So to jump back into this text here, we're continuing our story. This is the second feast that Esther has given for the king and Haman. And you might recall that Mordecai was recently honored, and Haman's wife, was concerned that perhaps Haman would not be able to overcome Mordecai and the Jews. And that was a bit of foreshadowing for what's going to happen here. So starting in verse 1, so the king and Haman went in to feast with King Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. The half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Now, this is a common phrase that's used by kings, up to half of my kingdom. We see it other places in the Old Testament, and it's available in other literature outside of the Bible. And it's probably not literally that he's going to surrender half of all of his kingdom to his queen, although he might. But it's sort of, I'll give you anything you want. And it's a way for a king to say that without, sort of kind of limiting it, if you will, in that regard. But the key part is that he's feeling pretty good towards Esther and wants to know what it is that he can do for her for all the things that she has done for him. So this is fascinating because of the fact that when I first read this story, she has this terrible burden of this thing that's going to be happening. And when I pictured her walking in a couple of chapters back into the king's presence in the court, and she walks up and she touches the gold scepter and she's allowed to speak. And he says, "What is it you wish?" I imagined, of course, that she would make her request right there. And we talked about that a little bit. As you recall, a couple sermons back. Well, why would she delay? Maybe she was trying to buy time. Maybe she was trying to put things together. Maybe it's making a more private request. That's why she did it in the form of a feast or a banquet. And so they go out from there and they come to the next, to the feast. And then at the feast, then she still doesn't ask. And so now this is the third opportunity. And for whatever reason, and I don't know that I can totally answer why, now the timing is correct. And maybe she has prayed about it. Maybe she feels that now, we say that God's timing is perfect. Perhaps it is that she feels a peace in her spirit, and now is the right time to say this. Perhaps there are other things that are going on. Well, whatever the case, it's very clear that Esther has very carefully planned out what she will say and how she will respond. So then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request." So it's very interesting. If you go back into what the king said, what is your wish and what is your request? And so she asked for herself, her own life, for her wish, and for her people, the Jewish people, for her request. So at this point, she undoubtedly has the king's attention, if you will. Stepping into it then, said, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." Now, that's perhaps a tad redundant, but it certainly drives the point home that her people are going to be wiped out and killed one by one. And she makes this fascinating statement. I'd like to know what you think about it. "If we were to be sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." So put your hands over on the keyboard, and I've got two questions for you on this. One is, do you think that she was right in that saying that they were only going to be sold as slaves, that she should still stay quiet? Was that not enough if they were going to be sold as slaves? I mean, what do you think? Was that a good choice or a bad choice, the first half of that sentence? If they were just going to be sold as slaves, well, then she wouldn't bother the king. She wouldn't mention anything. Is that a good choice? What would Mordecai have to say about that? You have to think about this and turn it over in your mind a little bit. What if Haman's plot was that he was going to sell them all as slaves to India, right? That was the plot. And she's saying, well, in that case, I wouldn't have said anything. Really? Okay. Amy says she knows how to speak to get his attention. True. I totally agree. Totally agree. But it's sort of interesting if you think about this. I don't know, obviously we don't know for sure what Esther would have done. Maybe the question might be, what would you have done if you saw the entire Jewish nation was going to be sold into slavery to another tribe, to the Egyptians, to the tribes that are in India, to another spot? If they were going to be sold into slavery, packed up and shipped off, if you were, all of the entire Jewish nation. What do you think? Something that, what would you have done? What would she have done? And so forth. Okay. Eileen's like, I fought it. She would have still said something. Fair enough. And perhaps she's just saying it. Maybe it's not totally accurate. Maybe she's just saying it as a way to go through. Okay. As slaves, they would still exist, so they would have hope to rebound. Yes. And in fact, one point here would be, what if they were going to be sold into slavery? What if they were to be carried off as slaves? Well, no offense. That is exactly what has happened. They are in the Babylonian exile right now. They have been carried off as slaves, if you all follow, right? I mean, you're kind of, this is an interesting concept. They're already in that state. This is where they are at this point. Now, it's an interesting point where they're having additional liberties, it appears. Mordecai is not, for example, working in a rock pit, breaking rocks. We don't know exactly what he's doing, but he doesn't seem to imply that. But they are not still totally free, if you follow. They're certainly not living in their own nation. So they are, in fact, living in that state at this time. Yes, some have been freed to go back, but they're not totally free either. Okay, Eileen says, isn't once enough? I would totally agree. So now, how about the second half of the sentence? This is a really fascinating one. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. What do you think that means? If we were to be sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Is that to mean that being sold into slaves doesn't compare with bothering the king for 10 minutes? Is that what that means? What does that sentence mean to you? What is exactly that she's saying there? I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Okay? Eileen says loss of his subjects and what they contribute. Yep. Okay, so that's one idea, is if they were going to be sold and sold as property to, again, another nation, like I'm suggesting Egypt or India, because those are other empires that are out there at the time. Okay, and so they would then have the loss of the queen. So this is one, was the idea is that if you're going to lose your subjects and lose the hopefully the positive effect of having the Jewish nation among you, then that's one. Ginger says, and his queen, right? He's going to lose his queen personally, right? That's a loss, right? Amy says she's saying the loss of her benefit to the king doesn't compare the affliction of her people. She's debasing herself. Okay, I think that's an angle of it. So this is sort of interesting, right? This is an interesting lead-in. So we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we were sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. So this is interesting. She is choosing this moment to speak because it is of dramatic and huge importance, that this is something huge that's there. And we're going to get back to this in our takeaways. It's sort of interesting, as it goes back to the children's sermon a little bit, how often do children come to us with requests, and how often do we go to God? Well, there's just some interesting points there. So then verse 5, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this? She has his attention. And Esther says, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. This is one of the paintings about this. It shows one of the responses. Obviously, this is Haman sitting off to the side at the feast. And many of the images that have been painted or drawn or done in movies have Esther pointing or gesturing. And it's this idea of pointing out the enemy, of course, identifying him. And so she's now, just in a few sentences, maybe even just a few moments, she's gone from, as Amy perhaps says, debasing herself and being there, to now she is the queen within her own right. Okay, she's has the approval of the king, if you will, to now speak freely. And at this moment, she's now going to speak with power and obviously clearly, and make her the request. Well, if not the request, at least the accusation clearly that's there. So it's interesting. At this point, it's obviously the king is furious. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. It's an interesting idea on Haman's part. Rather than trying to even talk to the king, he decides to try and influence the queen. So we'll confess that I'm not sure that was the best choice. Maybe it was the only choice he had. But nevertheless, since he was going to be killing her and her people, I think that his chances were probably better with the king, but maybe he had no chance at all. At any rate, it makes a bad situation much worse. Verse 8, and the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. So apparently in trying to get her attention, get close to her, he's trying to obviously get physically close to her, and he literally falls onto the couch, and the king basically assumes then that he's making an advance towards the queen. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So at this point, the other servants that are there are pretty clear how this is going to go down. And so they're going to head and draw something over his face. He's now the person who's doomed, of course. Okay. Then Harbana, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. So this is interesting. One of the eunuchs then who speaks up and said, nothing for nothing, sir, but just want to point out that this man who's now accused before you was just about to kill the man who saved your life. Okay? And so if that doesn't add insult to injury, if you will, then of course this, the king was in a wrath before. This makes it even more clear, of course, that the one he's going to be killing, Mordecai, is of course a Jew, and that he has arranged for the physical means by which that he will be killing Mordecai. Verse 10, and the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So this is a Jewish tradition, and it's not necessarily unfounded that it is with the exact device, action, plot, whatever you'd like to say, whatever the mechanism with which someone tries to destroy the Jewish people, that they themselves are often destroyed. Okay, this is a kind of a Jewish mindset, and it's not necessarily inappropriate. That there's examples of this. So this isn't, this is where we see this type of idea come about. So, as I said, this is going to be kind of a shorter sermon because this particular one, this piece there, I do have some takeaways for you. Just going through these few verses. Let's start with number 1. And I spent a long time thinking about this particular one. This is 4b. Number 1, there is something to be said for only asking when it's really important. Number 1, there's something to be said for only asking when it's really important. This is Esther 7:4b. If we had merely been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with loss to the king. So this is interesting. We can compare this a couple of different ways. Now, if you're speaking to your heavenly Father, I'm not quite referring to that. We are encouraged to bring all of our things to God the Father and be able to be in constant communication with him. I'm not suggesting, so please don't misunderstand, that I'm saying only pray about the big stuff. God wants to hear all of it, and so forth. My comment here is more in lines of a human nature. So if you're talking, let's say, with a boss, right? If you go to the boss with every tiny little thing, if you will, it is possible with some bosses and some work relationships, you're going to wear out your welcome. Does that make sense? Would you all agree with that? But so in terms of, the relationships we have here on earth, I think there is something to be said for only asking when it's really important, to being able to say, okay, this is a big deal. This is a really, really big deal. This is something that is worth mentioning. I had one of these at work this last week where there was something that occurred, and it was very important. And so I immediately raised it up my chain of command over on my side, and it was a big deal. And it worked out fine since I brought up the problem immediately, and we were able to resolve it, and it all worked out for the best. However, it was one of the things where it was kind of funny. I basically, my boss's boss commented, okay, Carl, good judgment realizing this was a big deal. Not quite so good judgment how I was proposing to resolve it, because I was thinking that I had the answer and I didn't actually. But it was followed by really good judgment that you brought it to all of our attention. before you went too far down the pathway on it. And so we slightly adjusted my plan for the solution and ended up doing what I said we were going to do, but just not quite the same way. Pardon me if I kind of talk around this for a second. And the point was, it was a big deal. In this particular case, it was a big deal because someone was physically in danger. And I said, oh, this is something I have to address immediately. And maybe that's obvious, but there are times when it's not always obvious. So there you go. And he mentions the idea of kind of the whiny child syndrome, that you have an interesting piece there. In fact, in speaking about this, it was kind of funny. My direct boss, her name's Michelle. Michelle commented that it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, right? And I said, it's kind of funny. When I worked at Toyota, we were encouraged to take some basic classes in Japanese, and I did that and learned just a few words here and there. But the important part was the way different idioms, different phrases, get translated into different cultures. And what I was taught there is that the translation for the squeaky wheel gets the grease, when it goes into Japanese and then comes back out into English again, sounds like this. It is the nail that sticks up that gets hammered down. And I said, that is not the same idiom. It was the general manager at Toyota that taught us this point, and I think he was making a statement. It's like, oh, okay. I think there's a lesson here. And there you go. So, all right. So number 2, I double-click there. Number 2, if you're going to ask, okay, having determined that this is important enough to ask, if you're going to ask big, okay? If you decided you're going to go in. And so Esther doesn't just ask for her own life. She asks for the entire nation, the entire Jewish nation, which is contained within the empire, if you will. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. You're asking what do I want? Okay, as long as I've already opened my mouth and I'm into it, ask the whole question. Nothing's worse than making the big deal of going to ask and getting half of what you thought you really needed and having to go back again. You'll follow? So if you're going to ask big. Go ahead and say, this is what would be, the ideal solution. Okay? And again, these are kind of generalities, but I think that they're worth mentioning here, and they relate to us. Number 3, be careful what you intend for others. It may come back to you. And I would hope that none of us have built a 50-cubit high gallows to hang our adversary upon. But nevertheless, I think we do have times when we have adversaries, perhaps in people we're struggling with. And there are times when we are saying, oh, I wish the following would happen, whatever. Hopefully not wishing them ill, mind you, but nevertheless, that they would not be around us or whatever. Be careful, because there's a funny thing in life that what happens, what you intend for others may come back to you. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, Esther 7:10a. And this gets us then to the question of the week. Is there something I need to ask God for this week? Again, you should take everything to God, big stuff and little stuff. He doesn't get tired. You're fine taking all that to him. But I would encourage you to think, is there something you need to ask for that you haven't been brave enough to ask? I mean, there may be something that you almost didn't want to trouble God with, or maybe you didn't even want to know, you almost didn't want to know the answer. You all follow? I mean, you're like, oh, I kind of, I don't know how to pray about it. Guess what? God knows the answer. And even the groanings of your spirit, the book of Romans tells us, the groanings of your spirit will be then translated into the perfect prayer that will be raised up to God the Father. So give it a shot. Think about what it is you need to ask God, and maybe you need to really ask. If nothing else, here's always a good question to ask. God, what's my next step I need to take? That's the whole idea of the Stepping Stones Project, is that we are all on a journey, every one of us, whether you're not yet a Christian, you just became a Christian, or even a Christian a long, long time. Regardless of where you are, there is a next step. And if you don't know what else to ask, maybe that's the question to ask, is God, how do I go deeper? How do I go further? What's my next step? Let's go to Lord in prayer. Lord Heavenly Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the story of Esther. We are encouraged by her bravery, by her courage, by her boldness to step forth and ask the important questions. Lord, let us to be bold and brave with you, and help us to ask the important questions and then sit and listen and wait for your answers. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen.